Hey, and thanks for joining me today. My name is Thomas. This is Matters of Mind. This is my channel. And in this series, I'm going through books on Jordan Peterson's great book list. Today, we're going to be talking about Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, as everything falls out of my book. Now, on the cover, it says over 16 million copies sold. And one of the things I wanted to start with while you click the like and subscribe button is why this book was so popular. And one of my favorite things that Frankl said in this book was actually in the preface when he was talking about why it's so popular. He didn't take it necessarily just as a compliment, but as a diagnosis of society. Why is it that a book about searching for meaning was so popular at the time? It's probably because that's what people are looking for, and that is a huge hole in our culture. And in this book, what he does is he looks for ways to identify how we find meaning in life, where it is, and he uses his experience in a concentration camp to help us understand what his ideas are about finding meaning, and where he saw it most. Now, the book is broken up into two major parts. The first part of the book is his experience in the camp, and well, camps, because what you find is if you read anything about concentration camps or gulags, anything like that, one of the things that's pretty consistent is that prisoners get moved around a lot. So he was in a few different camps. I know he did experience Auschwitz, but I don't think he was there the whole time. He doesn't get too much into where he was and where he was moving as much as he does the individuals in the camps with him and his experience in the camps and how that affected him psychologically and affected the people that he was with. Now, one of the things that I noticed is he talks about the shock that he went through and that everybody went through upon getting arrested and then heading towards the camp, getting to the camp, and getting initiated into camp life. It was very much like what Alexander Solzhenitsyn talks about in the Gulag Archipelago when he talks about his arrest. Everyone is shocked. So you have all of these people living in a society where one by one they start to see relatives, friends, acquaintances get arrested or go missing. And we always think, well, it's not going to happen to us. They must have done something until it does. And everybody had the same amount of shock, just like he did. And they're always holding out a bit of hope, like, oh, it's probably a misunderstanding. This couldn't be happening to me. I'm sure that we'll figure this all out. And even up until the time of being murdered, they still tended to hold out hope that something was going to happen, that it's all a big mistake, but it wasn't. And of course, many, many people died holding out that sense of hope. And part of what he looks at is why is it that we tend to all have that sense of hope, even in the face of what is inevitable tragedy. And in hearing him talk about that, the prisoners holding out hope, it made me wonder, like, maybe that's in part what's happening with our culture today. Even as things keep changing and getting adjusted, people often think, well, it's not that big of a deal. I'm sure things will work themselves out. I'm just going to focus on what I need to focus on. But I think our experience of the 20th century is that even as things get better, which for a lot of the world they were throughout the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution, just because things are and have been getting better does not mean that they necessarily will continue on that trajectory. Things can always get worse. Now, one thing that I learned about the initiation process through his book and his description of the camps is that as soon as they got off the trains, they had one individual guard who was pushing people to the left or to the right. Left, my left, your right. And what he was doing is deciding who was going to live and work and who was going to die later that day. And he said that almost 90% of all people went straight to the crematorium. And I didn't realize that so many people, out of the proportion of people who went to the camps, probably died within that same day. And very few actually stayed and worked and were part of the concentration camp system moving forward. And he went to a few different camps. I'm sure things change from year to year, day to day, but that was his experience. He also spends a lot of time talking about hunger and what it does to a human. And it was interesting because I don't think that we understand what that's like. I mean, in a society where we are actually overfed and we have more problems with people being obese than we have people starving to death, and all starvation, even worldly starvation, is largely political, not necessarily not having enough food, but not being able to get the food to people or people being restricted from having food. It's hard for us to understand what that's like and how incredibly all-encompassing hunger would be. And it reminded me of something that I've thought about before, which is we aren't really nice people. We are just well-fed people in a very nice society. And it makes me wonder what actually would happen as soon as people start to get hungry and their moods and their regulations change, and how quickly things can really go from completely normal, or our sense of normal, to incredibly bad and wretched and violent. Once people start to get hungry and start to really take that and apply it to getting food, not just for themselves, but for the people they're responsible for. Now, as Frankl entered the camps, he talks about um, essentially having his former self erased. Um, you go to one side, you're lucky enough to stay alive, and lucky is relative here, and then all your clothes are taken, all your possessions are taken, your rings, your watches, everything. You're shaved, and not just your head, but your whole entire body, and you're hosed down, and you're given a number. So from that point on, you're a number, and you don't have a name, and you're referred to by your number. And I think this little detail matters because we forget that numbers don't really exist. They are just representations of abstract concepts. So you can write the number one and say, well, there's one, but that's not actually one. It's just a representation of the concept of the number one. So when you apply that to a human being and they are a number, it's much easier to kill, destroy, torture, even in person, much less on the books, like we saw with on the trial of Eichmann, who was one of the administrators and orchestrators of the final solution. Um, when you see people no longer as people, but as abstract concepts that are what numbers are, that can add to the dehumanization that they experience and make it easier for people in that position to do horrible, terrible things. So overall, dehumanization through removing the humanity of a person in any situation, we should always be wary of, because that's the first step on the path to not seeing the humanity of a person at all. Now, as Frankl was entering the camp, he was hiding his manuscript for a type of psychology that he called logotherapy. And in his mind, it was his greatest work. And he, like I said earlier, was holding out hope that maybe there was a way he can keep it. And what would they care about a manuscript that doesn't hold any power? But once he realized that even that was being stripped from him, that his who he was before might as well have gone up in the ashes along with the people who were in the other line who were immediately cremated. You have to assume that whoever it was you were before you entered the camp no longer exists. And you have to start the transition into figuring out who you were in this situation and leave everything else behind. Now, that manuscript that he had was for something he called logotherapy. Now, the second half of the book focuses on logotherapy, and it's a different type of therapy compared to psychoanalysis, and he actually differentiated them easily or simplistically by saying it's like psychotherapy compared to psychoanalysis. And if you're interested in psychology or a therapist, you might find this second half of the book interesting. If not, I think you can get away with reading the first half of the book and get a good feel for why it's important to look into the darkness in order to see the light. Looking at the concentration camps and that horrible situation in order to help understand where he saw the light in humanity. But if you move on to the second half and read about logotherapy, um, it it describes what I think of as more developmental. So if you think of psychoanalysis and therapy in general as helping people deal with neurosis, deal with behavior or thought patterns that um, are considered pathological, what then happens to the people who maybe don't have a neurosis? They don't have some pathology. This can help people develop even beyond that and focuses more on the future to develop a sense of purpose and meaning, um, which can help people who don't necessarily have some neurosis they need to deal with, but also dealing with the neurosis of the past by looking ahead. So I think it would be fair to say that logotherapy, in Frankl's words, are much more about solving the neurosis of the past by looking forward and also giving people something to further develop beyond dealing with the neurosis that they've experienced or are plagued with. Now, I held up the book earlier. I'm going to do that again to show you the thickness of it. It's really not that long. And the first half of the book is less than 100 pages. I think in total it's less than 200 pages total. So I had this idea when I ordered the book that because it's such a popular book and so important when people talk about meaning, and as you read through this book, if you are a fan of Jordan Peterson or not, and if you've ever listened to anything he said, you could really hear his words coming from a lot of what Frankl has said about meaning and how important it is especially when you're faced with dire situations. What is going to maintain you when you are suffering? But it was really a lot shorter than I expected, very easy to read, and I can see in retrospect why it sold 16 million copies. It's not just because it is answering a question that people on some level were asking, but he also made it really easy to read. So it's not one of these huge textbooks that sometimes Jordan Peterson recommends reading that can be a long slog, even though they're worth it and great books. If you're looking for something that is short, sweet, and really enriching, I definitely recommend this book. So thanks again for joining me here on Matters of Mind. I've got a lot of other videos. Please do like and or subscribe. It really helps the channel to grow. And I will be back. My next book is going to be The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. So I'm slogging through that one, which is much longer than this book, but enjoying it so far. So come back and we'll talk about that one as well. Otherwise, have a great day.